Many people know Ford's WRC program from their success in the actual WRC era with the Focus and the Fiesta. But what many people don't remember is that that program started many decades ago with a successor to a humble economy family car. And that successor was called the Escort. The 105e generation of the Ford Anglia was Ford Europe's first sales sensation, and in a post-war Europe, it was easy to see why. It was cheap, small, practical, and efficient, perfect for the narrow streets of European cities. It was exactly what they wanted at that moment, and Ford sold 1 million of them. Literally. But like all greats, it was getting old and European tastes were beginning to change. They began wanting cars with a 0 to 60 time of under 27 seconds. I'll tell you what, the Anglia is many things, but fast is not one of them. Ford realized this, and they began a new design. Well, two to be specific, but we're only going to focus on one. They designed the Capri, which is awesome and deserves a video of its own, and the Escort. And they are similar in slightly different ways. Both of them are rear-wheel drive, both of them are light, and both of them had Coke bottle styling. However, the Escort was both a two-door, like the Capri, and a four-door and a state car. It was still a practical car. It had a well-packaged interior, and they hadn't lost touch. In that buyers just wanted a family car, so while sure it looked sporty, and it was definitely sportier than the Anglia, most of its engines were cross-flow four-cylinders designed for economy, which is why some markets got a 0.9-liter three-cylinder engine. And like the Anglia, it was a sales sensation. In the 8 years of Mark I Escort production, Ford sold over 2 million cars, a feat never before achieved by Ford outside of the US. Obviously, some of that was from the Anglia buyers of old, moving to the new platform, and others were from the reputation that the Anglia had built, but doubling the previous sales, there had to be a new market that they were tapping into. And that new market was the youth. The success of the Mustang 3 years earlier here in the States convinced Ford that youth liked fast, affordable vehicles, and that's exactly what the Escort could be, thanks to its 1,700-pound curb weight and the first rack and pinion steering system in a Ford. First, there was the 1300 GT, which had a new carburetor and tougher suspension. But that was really more of a warm-up for the first proper performance Escort, the 1968 Twin Cam. It was meant for racing. It had a 1.6-liter four-cylinder, originally destined for the Lotus Elan. That meant it had 105 horsepower and a top speed of 113, which I know you're scoffing at right now, because that's literally half the horsepower of a Toyota Camry. But again, it's half the weight of a Toyota Camry, and this is 1968, so get off of my back. And besides, in racing trim, that was bumped up to 200 horsepower, and when combined with the suspension and the light weight, it did the job. It entered the British Saloon Car Championship and took the 1968 crown easily. And this is where Cosworth gets involved. Cosworth and Ford already had a great relationship when they made the DFV V8, which was making mincemeat of everybody else in Formula One at the time. And Ford recognized their talent again, and asked Cosworth again to turn their sights on the Escort's four-cylinder. The result was the Cosworth BDA. It had 4 valves per cylinder and a cross-flow block, making 115 horsepower. And privateers used the nimble RS 1600 to take numerous national rally championships and touring car championships, including the European Rally Champ twice in a row. But its crowning achievement was much more global than that. The London to Mexico World Cup round was a 16,000-mile marathon through England, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Serbia, Bulgaria, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, Costa Rica, and finishing in Mexico City, Mexico. Some of the stages on their own were over 500 miles long. and Ford entered several Mark I RS 1600s fitted with more rugged shocks, a massive cowcatcher, and a more reliable, if less powerful, 1.9-liter Kent engine. So it was actually less powerful than some of the road cars. But this is an endurance job. We're not going for outright speed. We gotta cover 16,000 miles here, son. And their gamble worked. The modified RS 1600 driven by Hannu Mikkola beat the second place Triumph by over an hour, with another Escort in third. Even with more success later on in the Escort's career, the 1970 London to Mexico Rally may be the Escort's crowning achievement. It was so special that Ford made an Escort Mexico model in celebration with 85 horsepower and factory rally fogs. It's a great looking car, but it's not exactly the performance version that some people think it is. So if you're gonna buy one, be wary. It's about 30 horsepower down on the RS 1600s proper. Alright? Cool. The success of the first gen meant it was inevitable that a sequel be made. I mean, what, you think sequels are new nowadays? No, sequels have been around for centuries. And the Escort was no exception. The Mark II had some tweaks on the chassis, but the critical components were very much still the Mark I Escort. So think of it as an evolution of the Mark I, not so much a whole new model. The styling got a bit boxier as we transitioned from the 60s to the 70s, and the higher-end models got things like a glove box and vinyl seats. Ooh. But there is one big thing that changed between the Mark I and Mark II Escorts that had nothing to do with the cars per se, and that was that rallying got organized into the WRC. Like I said earlier, the Escort had already won multiple European rally titles, and Ford realized that the new Escort could be a genuine championship contender, and they saw Lancia homologate the Strato specifically for rallying. And they did the same with the Escort. It was called the RS 1800, and like the Mark II was to the Mark I, the RS 1800 was an evolution of the RS 1600 from the first gen. Now it had a 1.8-liter Cosworth BDE, which made 125 horsepower, giving the RS 1800 a 0 to 60 of under 9 seconds. But speed is not the most important thing when it comes to rallying. It's the corners that count. It's the average speeds across incredibly dangerous, treacherous roads that win the day. Which is why the homologation special Escort had fiberglass bodywork, a ducktail spoiler on the back, an air dam on the front, strengthened suspension, and a ZF 5-speed gearbox. Why did I say ZF instead of ZF? Because they're talking about Europeans, genius. The RS 1800 was entered into WRC Group 4 competition, going up against legends like the Fiat 131 Abarth, the Renault 5 Alpine, and the Stratos itself. And you know what? The plucky little Ford did alright, winning 11 rallies between 1975 and 1978, and then everything clicked in 1979. They won 5 events that year, including a podium lockout at Rally New Zealand, and despite close competition from Datsun, Ford was consistent enough at scoring podiums in the other events and successfully took the driver's and manufacturer's title. Then they didn't do too hot in 1980, with Ari Vatanen only winning a single event, but in 1981 they gave the Escort one last hurrah. The season was incredibly close. Talbot had managed to convince Lotus to build their Sunbeam hatchback into a rally monster. Renault had just launched the R5 Turbo, and Audi had launched the Quattro with all-wheel drive for the first time. I mean, there were so many legendary vehicles, it meant that each team won several different rallies. No single manufacturer dominated the sport, and that meant, despite Ari Vatanen only winning 3 events, he was able to take the driver's title with his RS 1800, scoring Ford's last WRC title until 2006. That was a send-off, if you will, to the second-gen Escort, because the third-gen came out in 1980, and the proper box the Escort had arrived, and it was noticeably blander. It was a completely new car from the ground up, which made it very good and very practical, just as the first-gen had always been designed to be. It also meant it was front-wheel drive, and had hatchback versions, and it had an engine lineup making at best 100 horsepower, and at worst 54 horsepower from a 1.6-liter diesel. The diesel version actually had a top speed of less than 90, but it did get over 70 mpg. No car today gets over 70 mpg. No car today gets over 50 mpg. Unless it's electric, and then it sort of cheats, because that will defeat the whole point. That's ridiculous. It is slower than Usain Bolt in a 400-meter sprint, but it doesn't matter, because it worked. Even with some harsh suspension, the Mark III was a bigger success than ever before, with 1.5 million units sold in just 6 years. The third gen also marked the first year the American Escort was made. It shares practically nothing with the European Escort, and I'm not going to talk about this bland, uninspiring blob of a vehicle anymore. Now, Ford realized that the European Escort was a bit bland, as I mentioned, and they decided to make some performance versions with the RS Turbo. It was front-wheel drive, and had a chassis that wasn't quite up to driving performance, and it made 130 horsepower, so technically it was the fastest road-legal Escort to date. And it actually wasn't that bad, to be honest. I know I sort of riffed on it, saying the chassis wasn't that great, and it wasn't, and it's front-wheel drive, which is worse than the rear-wheel drives, obviously, but it wasn't bad. It was not RS 1600 or 1800 levels, but it was okay. And they tried the same flashy upgrade system to the Rally program with similar results. The RS 1700T was a turbocharged version designed for Group B WRC. It was one of the most powerful rear-wheel drive cars ever for rallying at 300 horsepower. But the key is rear-wheel drive. When the Audi Quattro won 1982 championship with all-wheel drive, everybody knew rear-wheel drive was done, despite Lancia's efforts in 1983. So Ford scrapped the entire project except the engine, and built the mid-engined, all-wheel drive, 450 horsepower purpose-built supercar, the RS200. The RS200 is awesome, I love it, it's one of my favorite Fords ever made. The same cannot be said about the next few generations of Escort. You can tell they're getting boring because I'm grouping the 4th, 5th, and 6th generations into one batch. They were underwhelming, to put it bluntly. They were simple economy cars like the Camry or the Altima. That doesn't mean they're bad. In fact, sales were still strong, but all of the performance versions were gone except for a pretty boring XR3 and an admittedly pretty sweet RS200, which had a 150 horsepower engine from the Sierra and all-wheel drive. And you know what? By the turn of the century, it wasn't just the performance guys that were getting bored of the Escort. The public was getting bored as well. Think about it, it's a good song, but hearing it on the radio every 5 minutes without change makes it boring and you switch stations. And with the new Focus being launched globally, the Escort was finally killed off in 2002. There was one caveat to the 4th, 5th, and 6th generation Escorts and their blandness. And the reason why I didn't mention it is because technically, it's not an Escort. It's a Sierra Cosworth 4x4 with an Escort body on it. It was called the Escort RS Cosworth, and it was designed for the World Rally Championship. You see, the Sierra was too big for WRC's success, and Ford thought the smaller Escort could be great handling and a great throwback for marketing. Being a Group A homologation special meant that only 7,000 were ever built, but it's quality over quantity. All-wheel drive, Recaro seats, a hilarious whale-tail rear wing, and a massive turbo bolted onto the Cosworth YBT engine. It was the fastest Escort ever, with 230 horsepower and a weight of just 2,700 pounds with all-wheel drive. It did 0 to 60 in 5.7 seconds, but believe it or not, the tuning shops looked at the engine block, because Cosworth notoriously overbuilt its engine blocks, and said that 230 horsepower figure just isn't enough, you know? So they built tuning setups that could offer you up to 1,000 horsepower with, I'm guessing anyway, a murderous turbo lag. Let that sink in. 1,000 horsepower in an all-wheel drive, sub 3,000 pound hatchback with crazy aerodynamics. I mean, what is this, a Lancia Delta S4? I guess it was a good thing, then, that the Escort Chassis was the first car to produce real downforce at both the front and the rear, thanks to an adjustable front splitter and the obvious whale tail. The question is, though, did it work? No, not really. The Group A Escort was an oddity. It won a lot of rallies, including its debut in the 1994 Monte Carlo, but it never added up to anything. Toyota, Subaru, Mitsubishi were all at the top of their game in the mid-90s, and Ford had to heavily rely on their driver lineups to even up the playing field. And when that guy was injured, their pace fell apart. Even later seasons driven by double champion Carlos Sainz had pace, but no championships. But you know what? It doesn't matter, because the Escort is still in the history books. With its 31 wins, it's the 8th most successful rally car of all time, and it's regarded as one of the greatest cars to never win a WRC title. And I think that's a good way to sum up the Escort. A lot of people don't know about it, certainly here in America. Because, well, our Escort was an uninspiring blob that looked more like a Taurus than a Mustang. But the Escort that everybody else knows is a legend. On the track, on the road, on the dirt, it doesn't matter. It was never the fastest, it was never the absolute best handling, but it was affordable, and it made everybody say, that could be for the family, and on the weekends, I can have some fun with it. It was an affordable legend that we may never see the likes of again.